Welcome to Sleepy History, where we slow things down and let the past speak softly. Tonight, we're going back to Elizabethan England, a time of ruffled collars, royal banquets, and oddly enough, a surprising number of napkins. Get cozy, settle in, and let this quiet corner of history ease you into rest. If you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories told at a slower pace. And if you're still with me by the end, I'd love to know, what's the strangest or most charming table rule you've ever come across? Let's begin. Tonight we were stepping into a world you've probably never thought twice about, one thick with roast goose, velvet doublets, and more folded cloth than a royal laundry basket. That's right, we're talking about napkins. Specifically why Elizabethan England had so many of them. You find yourself standing in the middle of a smoky Tudor tavern. There's a pungent mix of meat, and body odor wafting through the air. A boar's head stares down at you from the wall, looking mildly offended. Somewhere in the corner, a man is juggling apples and swearing quietly at a lute. And you unlucky time traveler that you are very hungry. A platter of food is being shoved your way, heaped high with pies, turnips, and something vaguely bird-like. No forks in sight, of course, just your hands. And here comes the real challenge. Where do you wipe them? You reach for what you think is a napkin only to realize it is the edge of someone's doublet. Oops. Your next option is your sleeve, which is what most commoners actually did back then. But wait, aren't there napkins? You've heard about them. Great, folded linen squares, somewhere. You scan the trestle table. There are cloths, for sure, but are they meant for your face, your hands, or the serving platters? Welcome to the bizarrely complex etiquette jungle that was 16th century dining. And napkins, humble though they seem, are right at the heart of it. Why? Because in a world where social rank dripped from every feathered cap and embroidered hem, how you wiped your mouth said almost as much about you as your ancestry. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're rewatching from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the table. The man beside you is enthusiastically gnawing a roasted partridge. Grease glistens down his chin like a wax seal on a royal decree. But he's got something you know in a napkin. Sort of. It's a linen strip tucked into his collar, more bib than napkin, really, but still something of a marker. You, meanwhile, are eyeing the hem of the tablecloth. Don't do it. That's for wiping trenchers and platters, not for commoners to dab their faces with. That little slip-up might earn you a judgmental side-eye or worse, a poetic insult. See, napkins weren't just about keeping clean. They were props in a larger performance. Elizabethan meals, especially among the upper classes, were elaborate ceremonies. And just like the right spoon or goblet, the right napkin signaled that you belonged. Or didn't. Historians still argue whether the average Tudor yeoman actually used individual napkins or simply relied on shared table linens. But we do know this. As you climb the social ladder, napkin usage gets increasingly theatrical. Nobles didn't just have napkins. They had attendants to bring them, folded just so, starched to a dangerous stiffness. Sometimes perfumed, and let's talk about starch. In Elizabethan England, starch wasn't just for collars and ruffs, it was for napkins too. You wanted your napkin to stand up on its own, like a tiny fabric monument to cleanliness and control. The stiffer the cloth, the less likely it was to crumple into disgrace during a meal. Was this practical? Not at all. But it looked impressive, and that's what counted. There's something deeply amusing about the idea that in a country riddled with plague, poor drainage, and dubious dental care, napkins were a frontier of refinement. But they were. In fact, the etiquette manuals of the time, Those delightful little books that told you which end of a knife to hold and how loudly to slurp, often dedicated entire pages to napkin usage. Hold it over your left shoulder. Don't tuck it into your collar unless you're under 7 or a foreigner. Use it to blot your lips, not your forehead. Never ever blow your nose into it. And yet, they still did, even in the highest circles. One 1590s dinner account casually mentions a guest using a napkin to dab at a mild nosebleed. Dignified? Not exactly, but better than the sleeve. You decide to follow suit, carefully dabbing your fingers on what looks like a communal handcloth hanging at the end of the table. It's damp. You pretend not to notice. In a world before antibacterial soap or disposable anything, fabric napkins were actually a minor miracle. They were reusable, washable, and versatile. But they were also expensive. Linen didn't grow on trees. So napkins were often carefully laundered, mended, even inherited. A particularly fine set might be monogrammed or dyed faintly pink from red wine stains that never quite came out. But the most bewildering thing, the sheer quantity. Wealthy households stocked napkins like they were hoarding for the apocalypse. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, folded in drawers, bundled in trunks, ready for feasts, visitors, emergencies, and whatever else life in a drafty manner might throw your way. It's like an arms race, but for linens. Your neighbor has 30 napkins. Better make it 50. The Lord Mayor of London reportedly owns several thousand pieces of table linen, many of them napkins. And don't get smug, those napkins had to be counted, tracked, and washed by hand. Spare a thought for the laundry maids. There's even a recorded job napkin bearer. That's right. A person whose full-time duty was literally to carry, distribute, and sometimes fold napkins. You're beginning to see just how deep the rabbit hole goes. So as you sit at this long, groaning trestle table in your itchy woolen tunic, trying to determine whether it's polite to lick your fingers, remember this: napkins weren't just cloths. They were status, they were theater, and they were everywhere. You've managed to wipe your fingers without scandal for now, but you're restarting to notice just how many types of napkin-like objects are floating around this meal. There's a wide cloth on your neighbor's lap. There's another tucked into someone's sleeve. One unfortunate lad seems to be using his ruff, that stiff, frilled collar of linen, as a combination bib and napkin. It's surprisingly hard to tell what's a napkin and what's just fabric. In Elizabethan England, cloth was everywhere, and each piece served a specific purpose, though not always the one you'd expect. That frilled ruff, it's not meant to catch soup splatters, but it sure does. The tablecloth, technically for the table, but people definitely wiped their hands on it. And sleeves, well, they were the default for the unwashed masses, especially in the countryside. Historians still argue whether common folk actually had consistent access to separate napkins. The evidence is thin, like most peasant ale. What we do know is that among the wealthy, the line between clothing, table linen, and accessory blurred constantly. One 16th century etiquette book warns you never to wipe your mouth on your doublet, but then another says that if the meal is informal, a sleeve might suffice. The double standard is strong with this one. There were also hand cloths, long strips of linen that hung over the edge of the table, meant to be shared by diners for wiping greasy hands. Think of them as the Elizabethan version of a restroom paper towel dispenser, but far less hygienic. Sometimes these hand cloths were even perfumed to mask the lingering aroma of roast meats and anchovy paste. And if that sounds over the top, remember, this was the era of scented gloves, rose water for your beard, and starching your underpants if you were very fancy and very bored. Now imagine you're a guest in a prosperous merchant's home. You sit at a polished oak table, and before you is a neatly folded square of white linen, bordered with fine red thread. This is your individual napkin, a relatively new invention for the middle classes. You pick it up. You hesitate. What do you do with it? The wrong move could mark you as uncultured. Do you place it in your lap? Not yet. That custom won't be universal for a couple more centuries. Do you tuck it in your collar like a bib? That's acceptable if you're dining with your family, but deeply embarrassing at a nobleman's table. The safest route? Over your left shoulder folded, not crumpled. It's the dining equivalent of a power pose. And just when you think you've mastered the basics, someone across the table folds their napkin into a swan. Not joking. Napkin folding was a minor art form in Elizabethan times. Elaborate folds, fans, rosettes, even animals were fashionable among the elite. It's like origami, but with fewer dragons and more poultry. One surviving book from the late 16th century, The New Book of Table Folding, includes diagrams for creating napkin shapes like the double horn or the bread trench. Historians still argue whether these napkin sculptures were purely decorative or had functional meanings like signaling the number of courses to come or your host's level of smugness. Of course, all this folding required starch, lots of it. Napkins were soaked, pressed, and ironed until they could practically hold up a ceiling beam. A perfectly starched napkin could stand on its own, like a soldier awaiting orders. Imagine trying to softly dab your mouth with a rectangle of weaponized linen. It's less gentle cloth and more mild assault. And here's the weird part. Some napkins weren't even used. They were just displayed, carefully laid out as part of the dining room, as visual landscape proof of your wealth and good taste. A kind of soft, quiet brag, like hanging a dozen decorative towels in your guest bathroom and threatening anyone who tries to use them. In elite households, the boundaries got even murkier. There were cup towels to wipe goblets between guests, trench cloths for cleaning the wooden plates, and voider cloths for removing scraps from the table. That's right, you're not just dealing with one napkin here. You're dealing with an entire cloth ecosystem. And if you're a servant, you'd better know the difference. Use a voider cloth to wipe your hands, and you'll never serve goose again. This textile confusion wasn't limited to England. Across Europe, the use and form of napkins varied wildly. The French, ever the pioneers of flair, favored large, finely hemmed serviettes by the late 1500s. The Italians leaned into folding and scented fabrics, turning every dinner into a low-stakes linen ballet. The Germans, well, they liked big napkins. One traveler reported a single cloth large enough to double as a small tent. But in England, where practicality often lost to pageantry, the napkin's identity remained wonderfully chaotic. Was it a marker of refinement, a necessary tool, a mildly weaponized dinner decoration? The answer usually was yes. Meanwhile, back at your tavern table, a fresh plate is being served venison pasty with a suspiciously twitchy sauce. You look for a napkin, there isn't one. The handcloth is damp. Your sleeve is warm. You sigh, pick up a corner of the tablecloth when no one's looking, and try not to think about how many hands have done the same. It's moments like these when you begin to appreciate the napkin's quiet complexity. In a world where everything was used, reused, and repurposed, the napkin floated between utility and symbolism, comfort and class. And if you were really unlucky, you might confuse it with a bread plate and try to eat it. Don't laugh, it's happened. The morning after your ill-fated tavern dinner, you wake up in a modest Elizabethan lodging house, still clutching a vague memory of that suspiciously crunchy venison pasty. Your hands are somehow both greasy and dry, an impressive paradox, and your sleeve now smells like someone used it to mop a fishmonger's stall. Naturally, your mind turns to napkins. Where did these things come from? Why are they so central to the Tudor dining experience, and yet so oddly inconsistent? You roll out of your lumpy straw mattress and decide to follow the linen trail all the way back to its roots. The napkin, it turns out, has humble beginnings. Long before Elizabethan England started starching the life out of every square inch of linen, earlier cultures were already experimenting with table textiles. The ancient Greeks had a cloth called the chironax, hand towel used during meals. Romans followed suit with their own nappi, which were individual dining cloths provided for guests. These could be used to dab the fingers, protect the toga, or if no one was looking, squirrel away a particularly nice honey cake. That last part, by the way, is not a joke. Historians still argue whether Roman diners were encouraged to bring their own napkins, just so they could smuggle home leftovers in them. It's the ancient version of a to-go box, but significantly more absorbent. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and we find that napkins don't quite disappear, but they lose their individuality. Communal cloths reign supreme. At large feasts, a single long towel might stretch across the whole table, available for everyone to use. These shared hand cloths, while practical in a world short on laundry soap, were also little germ festivals. But nobody knew about microbes yet, so communal wiping was just fine if a bit damp. By the time we reach the 15th and early 16th centuries, individual napkins begin to reappear slowly, hesitantly, and mostly in wealthy households. This shift coincides with the rising popularity of elaborate banquets and a growing obsession with manners. You see, etiquette wasn't just about avoiding scandal. It was about controlling the chaos of shared meals in a crowded, smelly, occasionally plague-ridden society. And napkins? They became part of the solution. Imagine a feast in the early Tudor court, dozens of dishes, dozens of hands, a dozen ways to commit a faux pas. You're seated between two minor nobles who keep eyeing your table manners like hawks eyeing a limping mouse. Your napkin, neatly folded beside your trencher, is your only shield. You reach for a bite of stewed quince. Juice runs down your fingers. You glance at your napkin. Should you wipe? Fold? Dab? Historians still argue whether there was a standardized set of gestures by this point, but etiquette manuals begin to offer advice that makes it clear. If you're seen licking your hands, you're out. The earliest surviving English references to the word napkin appear around the late 14th century, deriving from the Old French nap with the diminutive kin attached literally, little tablecloth, which is adorably literal, if nothing else. These proto-napkins weren't yet common, and certainly not used in your average ale-soaked farmhouse. But as the 16th century dawns, something changes. Suddenly, having many napkins becomes fashionable. Not just one per person sets of them. Large ones, small ones, folded ones, backup ones. Whole chests dedicated to the storage of dining linens. Inventories from aristocratic households often list 5 dozen napkins, white linen with embroidery, or 32 napkins fringed for guest use. Linen production was becoming more efficient, and England's growing textile trade meant more fabric for those who could afford it. Of course, affordability was relative. Linen was still a luxury item. Flax had to be cultivated, harvested, soaked, combed, spun, and woven mostly by hand. It was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Owning dozens of napkins signaled not just cleanliness, but wealth. You had the linen, the servants to wash it, and the storage space to keep it pristine. In a society obsessed with appearances, that kind of linen abundance whispered luxury more loudly than gold buttons ever could. And so the napkin crept its way into English dining rituals, not just as a tool, but as a status symbol. The more napkins you had, the more refined you were perceived to be. And this is how you, dear time-traveling diner, now find yourself standing in a well-to-do household, staring into a sideboard drawer brimming with folded cloth, wondering which one you're allowed to touch. You pick one up cautiously. It smells faintly of lavender and starch. It's square, neatly hemmed and warm from the sun filtering through the lidded glass windows. You fold it once, twice, and drape it over your arm like you've seen the footman do. Somewhere behind you, a servant nods in approval. You might just survive dinner after all. What's fascinating is that napkins didn't evolve in a straight line. Different regions developed their own customs, and even within England, practices varied wildly depending on your class, location, and whether or not you were currently trying to impress a neighbor with your knowledge of Flemish embroidery. Even the color of napkins could carry meaning. White was preferred, associated with purity, refinement, and an alarming ability to highlight any gravy-related error. But colored napkins weren't unheard of, especially among the fashion-forward or laundry-averse. Some households kept a separate set of napkins specifically for feast days, dyed subtly or embroidered with seasonal motifs. Because nothing says Christmas like wiping your mouth on a cloth decorated with gooseberries and ominous Latin phrases. As you glance around the room, you realize how thoroughly napkins have infiltrated the rhythm of the day. They're no longer just practical, they're ceremonial. Folded, placed, offered, accepted. Like little cotton soldiers, each one awaiting its moment in the meal's unfolding drama. And when the drama ends, they're gathered, inspected, counted, and returned to storage as carefully as if they were rare books. You begin to suspect that napkins are not just part of the meal. In some ways, they are the meal. You've made it through breakfast, lunch, and an accidental mid-morning pie. By now, the rhythm of Elizabethan dining is starting to feel, if not natural, at least less confusing. You've stopped using your sleeve, mostly. You even folded a napkin into something that vaguely resembled a goose, though one child mistook it for a crumpled turnip. A win is a win. But there's something else that's becoming increasingly clear. Meals in this era are about more than just food. They're a performance, a pageant, a delicate, choreographed ballet of elbows, platters, cups, and cloths. And right in the middle of that performance is the napkin, fluttering between fingers, draped across shoulders, poised like a tiny linen actor waiting for its cue. Welcome to the rise of the table ritual. In Elizabethan England, the act of dining, especially in noble and wealthy households, was not just about eating. It was about demonstrating order, harmony, civilization, and nothing embodied that more clearly than the strict codes of table etiquette, many of which centered on what to do with your hands. Your hands, after all, were your main utensils. No forks yet, remember. Just knives, spoons, and a flexible relationship with germs. Historians still argue whether forks had started to appear in England by the late 1500s. There's evidence they were known, but rarely used, considered foreign, fussy, and possibly immoral. In one case, a church official even referred to them as diabolical prongs. So, hands it was. Which meant that keeping those hands and the rest of your face respectably clean became something of an art form. This is where the napkin really shines. And not just the napkin itself, but the presentation of it. You take your seat at a grand oak trestle table in a well-heeled household. Before the meal begins, servants enter carrying bowls of rose water and linen cloths. The guests extend their hands to be washed, an elegant little prelude to the meal, equal parts hygiene and theater. Your napkin is already in place, folded neatly and placed on your trencher. You glance at the others. Some lift their napkin immediately and place it over their shoulder. Others leave it untouched until the first course arrives. You hesitate. One wrong move and you'll be labeled a barbarian. A servant approaches to offer wine. You nod, perhaps too eagerly. He spills a few drops onto your napkin. No one gasps, but you catch the flicker of a smirk from the woman across the table. Disaster. You resist the urge to dab at it. Better to pretend it didn't happen. You are elegance. You are linen. As the food arrives course after course of meats, breads, custards, and sweetmeats, the napkin becomes a kind of trusted companion. You use it to clean your fingers, to gently wipe your lips, even to cover your mouth when you speak. Open-mouthed chewing and talking with a full mouth were already frowned upon. But if you must speak mid-bite, a polite napkin cover was better than letting your words fly free, along with any loose crumbs. What's remarkable is how consistent this etiquette was across the elite classes. Manuals and guides from the time like the Book of Curvinge and the Book of Nurture laid out detailed behavioral expectations, especially for the young men of gentry families. These books didn't just cover which meats to avoid or how to carve a goose. They also instructed you on how to handle a napkin with dignity. One such rule, never blow your nose in your napkin, that was strictly for your sleeve, which somehow isn't better, but still. And if you had to sneeze, turn away from the table, then dab. Bonus points if you did it silently. You begin to notice the rhythm. A guest dabs their fingers. A servant offers a fresh cloth. Someone gestures for more food and then gracefully wipes their hands before accepting the platter. It's all very smooth, like a well-rehearsed play. In fact, some scholars argue that the rise of table rituals like these mirrored the Elizabethan love for stagecraft. Both the dinner table and the theater required an audience, timing, props, and very good memory. And as in theater, the cloth became part of the character. A man with a crisp, well-folded napkin over one shoulder conveyed control, poise, clean fingernails. A man fumbling with a crumpled rag looked like he'd wandered in off the street. Even if he had a title, his napkin told a different story. There's an anecdote, possibly apocryphal, but too delightful not to mention, of a dinner guest who brought his own napkin to a feast, embroidered with his initials and laced with imported saffron. Not for any practical reason, but simply to make sure no one mistook him for someone who borrowed his linens. That's the Elizabethan version of flexing a personalized water bottle at the gym. Napkins were also deeply gendered. Men's napkins tended to be larger, stiffer, and plainer symbols of restraint and dignity. Women's napkins, by contrast, were smaller, often scented, and decorated with lace or floral embroidery. Of course, both had the same purpose, but as with everything else in Tudor society, even wiping your face came with gendered expectations. And let's not forget napkin hierarchy. Not everyone at the table received the same quality of cloth. The lord and lady might have linen spun so fine it shimmered in candlelight, while lower guests had something closer to heavy canvas. Servants? No napkins at all. Just the occasional damp cloth passed between duties, and perhaps a flick of the apron when no one was watching. Still, the sheer presence of so many napkins stacked in cupboards, laid across shoulders, folded into fans and florals, tells you something crucial about the Elizabethan worldview. Cleanliness, yes, order, of course, but also visibility. You were meant to be seen handling your napkin properly. You were meant to be judged by it. In a society where one poorly timed burp could cost you an invitation or a promotion, the napkin wasn't just cloth. It was character. You reach for your own napkin, now slightly wrinkled from anxious fidgeting. You fold it with deliberate care. You nod toward your neighbor. They nod back. For a fleeting second, you belong here. All thanks to a piece of fabric. You're beginning to think you've cracked the code. Napkin folded just right. Fingers dabbed after every suspiciously moist bite. You even covered a cough with something resembling grace. But now, the servant is approaching with another tray, and he's giving you that look. The one that says, "Don't ruin this duck liver tart with your peasant hands." You reach instinctively for your napkin. It crinkles audibly, like a small thunderclap of overstarched linen. Because here's the thing, Elizabethan napkins weren't just clean. They were stiff, starched within an inch of their threads. And that's not by accident. It's fashion, darling. Welcome to the world of monogrammed, starched, and borderline weaponized napkins. You gently set your napkin aside, and as it lands on the table, it bounces. That's not normal for fabric. But in late 16th century England, it was an aesthetic ideal. Napkins were often treated with wheat-based starches, carefully ironed, and left standing in ornate shapes. You weren't just presenting a cloth, you were unfolding a minor architectural marvel. Historians still argue whether the obsession with starched linen started with tablecloths or clothing, but it's clear the two quickly fed off each other. Ruffs, cuffs, collars, and yes, napkins all became increasingly sculptural as the Elizabethan period wore on. There's something almost absurdly theatrical about it. Imagine walking into a dinner party today and finding your napkin standing upright in the form of a prancing stag. You'd assume the host either loved you or lost a bet. But back then, it was perfectly respectable. If your napkins weren't stiff enough to stand, you risked looking sloppy or worse, unfashionable. That's where monogramming came in. A finely stitched set of initials on your napkin didn't just tell people whose it was. It also whispered, "I care deeply about appearances, and I have time to spare." Monogram napkins became particularly popular among the emerging gentry families newly wealthy from trade, eager to show their refinement. Personalized linen, often stored in carved wooden chests lined with sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rosemary, was a quiet form of social ladder climbing. It said, "We're not old nobility, but our napkins could fool you." And it worked. Wealthy merchants and minor nobles began to compete over linen quality the way modern homeowners compete over artisanal sourdough. The length of the cloth, the delicacy of the weave, the intricacy of the embroidery, it was all up for comparison. You can almost picture two Tudor matrons engaging in a passive-aggressive compliment war. "Oh, yours is plain, how elegant. Ours are simply covered in acorns and vines. A bit much, I know." You, of course, are still just trying to figure out which end of your napkin is for hands and which is for lips. The fashion for starched linen also created an entirely new trade, the professional starcher. These were often women, skilled in the delicate, dangerous art of boiling, pressing, and sculpting linen into submission. The process required boiling wheat or rice starch into a paste, applying it by hand, and then drying the cloth into its final shape with hot irons. Done right, you got crisp, pristine folds. Done wrong, you got a lumpy, flammable nightmare. Some starchers added dyes or perfumes to the mix, especially among the more flamboyant households. A pale blue or pink hue, faintly scented with orange blossom, could turn your napkin into something approaching a love letter. But beware, using the wrong scent or color could cause scandal. One poor noblewoman reportedly ruined her dinner reputation by choosing a napkin dyed too dark a color associated with mourning. No one touched the bread rolls. There were also practical concerns. A heavily starched napkin might be beautiful, but it was about as absorbent as a roof tile. Many guests quietly requested a second, softer cloth for actual use, hiding the first napkin like a trophy they had no intention of risking. Others didn't dare use it at all, tucking it neatly under their trencher and pretending they'd eaten with magically clean hands. Still, the ritual persisted. The starching, the folding, the delicate embroidery, it was all part of the spectacle. And it meant something. Not just cleanliness or refinement, but care. The message was clear. I prepared for you. I considered every detail, even the napkin. And there was something else to consider napkin placement. A folded square on the trencher meant one thing. Draped over the shoulder, another. Some hosts insisted that napkins be laid across the lap, though this wasn't yet standard in England. Others folded them into cones and placed them in goblets. It was a silent code like semaphore, but with fewer shipwrecks and more gravy. In some cases, the napkin even served as a menu. Folded in a particular way, it could signal how many courses were coming, or who was hosting, or whether the meal was being served in honor of a saint's day. It was like origami, but with passive-aggressive undertones. One anecdote from a 1598 merchant's diary mentions a dinner guest who folded his napkin into the shape of a goose before the main course arrived. The host, apparently offended by this premature poultry, retaliated by serving him eel pie. Cold. Napkin wars were real. As you dab your fingers with your increasingly crunchy napkin, you reflect on all this absurdity. The folding, the starch, the embroidery. It's easy to laugh, especially when the cloth pokes you in the chin like a disapproving ant. But there's also something oddly sweet about it, because beneath all the frills and rituals lies a basic human truth. People want to feel prepared, dignified, welcomed. And even in a world of chamber pots and rat-plagued alleyways, Elizabethans found beauty in the little things. A folded square, a stitched letter, a faint scent of rosemary. You look down at your napkin. It's just fabric, but it's also a message, one carefully ironed letter at a time. The longer you stay in Elizabethan England, the more you begin to understand that nothing is ever just what it seems. Bread is sometimes a plate, beer is sometimes safer than water. And napkins? Well, napkins are social armor. You're seated now at a slightly fancier table than yesterday's. There's more silverware this time, still not a fork in sight. Of course, but the real showpieces are the linens. Crisp napkins rest across every trencher, each one folded so precisely it feels like you should apologize before touching it. You lift yours gingerly, it smells faintly of sage. A nice touch. You're no longer panicking over where to place the thing, which means you've made progress. But now comes a subtler challenge, how you use it, and what that says about you. Because here, in Elizabethan society, a napkin isn't just about hygiene. It's a small, silent billboard of your respectability. And one wrong move could say all the wrong things. Take the act of wiping your mouth. Too often, and you appear anxious or overeager. Not enough, and you risk looking uncouth. There's a sweet spot just enough to show restraint, cleanliness, and that elusive Tudor trait, self-command. This, of course, assumes you haven't sneezed on your napkin, because if you have, you're officially no longer polite company. Historians still argue whether these subtle etiquette rules were enforced more strictly at court than in the homes of merchants or minor nobles. But contemporary accounts suggest that even modest households took pride in appearing orderly. Clean napkins, neat folds, and timely dabbing were marks of a family that understood its place in the social food chain and how to climb it. You glance across the table. A young man, maybe 16, is using his napkin as a bib. He's tucked it right into his collar and is eating with the zeal of a hungry hound. His mother's face has gone as pale as a boiled turnip. You make a mental note, shoulder or lap. Never beb, unless you're 7 or Italian. The reality is, napkins offered a rare opportunity for subtle social signaling. Unlike clothing, which was often dictated by sumptuary laws, or home furnishings, which few guests would see, napkins were on full display. They moved with you. They reflected your actions. They became part of your social performance. And sometimes, they saved you. You remember a story told by the host earlier in the evening, probably exaggerated, but still revealing. A visiting nobleman, halfway through a feast, accidentally spilled a dollop of stewed quince across his lap. The horror. Without missing a beat, he reached for his napkin, covered the spot, and carried on as if nothing had happened. His poise was so complete, guests later claimed they didn't see the stain at all. Was it true? Who knows? But it became a legendary example of the napkin as a shield, not just for flesh, but for dignity. In this way, napkins helped people navigate the minefield of Elizabethan social life. A poorly timed burp, an errant splash of gravy, a sliver of eel stuck in the teeth, any of these could lead to gossip, but a well-placed napkin could buy you time, buy you cover, buy you grace. And it wasn't just about you. Offering a guest a napkin, especially a fine one, freshly washed and folded, was a statement. You are welcome, you are worthy of clean cloth. Refusing a napkin, on the other hand, could suggest mistrust or insult. In one account, a guest at a manor refused the napkin provided to him, claiming it was sour with damp. The host, deeply offended, allegedly sent the man home with only a piece of bread and no meat. The Tudor version of unfriending someone. You can't help but smile at the absurdity. A rectangle of cloth wielding such influence. But it makes sense in a society obsessed with order. If your ruff could signify wealth, if your shoes could signal your class, why not your napkin? And if napkins were armor, then they required maintenance. That meant laundering, starching, and inspecting, sometimes obsessively. In noble households, a single napkin might be washed by hand in lye, rinsed in river water, dried on a hedgerow, ironed with a heated brass tool, and then scented with lavender before being stored. Multiply that by dozens or even hundreds of napkins, and you begin to appreciate the quiet tyranny of linen management. Some noble women reportedly kept linen ledgers records tracking how many napkins they owned, how many had been used that week, and which servant was responsible for each washing cycle. Lose a napkin, and you might be accused of theft. Stain one beyond salvation, and you could be reassigned to mucking out the dovecotes. And yes, servants had their own napkin rules. The napkin a guest used was not the same as the cloth a servant might carry over one arm. That servant's napkin, sometimes called a servitor cloth, was for practical tasks, wiping goblets, holding hot plates, or catching crumbs. To use a guest's napkin for any of those things would be a serious breach of decorum. The wrong cloth and the wrong hands at the wrong time scandal. The layers of linen-based meaning seem endless. Napkins became, in essence, soft-spoken gatekeepers. They divided the genteel from the vulgar, the careful from the careless, the gracious from the gauche. And you, dear listener, are learning to read them like a seasoned courtier. You notice now how different guests fold their napkins after use, some into perfect squares, others into loose rolls. You see how the older men dab once before each course, while the younger ones wipe their fingers like they're sanding wood. You begin to understand that every napkin tells a story, and the more you notice, the better you get at navigating the quiet battlefield of dinner. So you sit back, satisfied, napkin across your lap. The food is rich, the company watchful, and your linen armor firmly in place. Evening descends on the city, and the candlelight dances across the platters and pitchers, casting long shadows over everything, including your slightly wine-stained napkin. You folded it neatly beside your trencher, just like you saw the gentleman to your left do. Not because you need to dinners only paused for the next course, but because it feels like the thing someone with impeccable manners would do. And that's the truth of it now. You're no longer just using a napkin. You're performing with it. Quietly, yes, subtly, but unmistakably. Each dab, fold, and flick of linen is now part of your identity. As this realization settles, you begin to wonder, what did people do before all this? Before there were etiquette books and starch artisans and scented cupboards? Did anyone care if you wiped your hands on a loaf of bread or flicked gravy from your chin into the fireplace? The answer, as always, is yes, but not in quite the same way. To understand where napkin etiquette came from, you have to go outside the dining hall, out of the manor houses and into the bustling, muddy streets of Elizabethan cities and towns. Because while you've seen how the upper classes dined, most people weren't arranging napkin swans or folding linen roses. They were eating on their feet at crowded inns or in cramped, smoky cottages. And in these spaces, the napkin played a very different role. Among common folk, napkins were often whatever was handy, if anything at all. A shared towel, a corner of a tablecloth, or the inside of one's own cap. In taverns, a bit of rough cloth might be nailed to the wall for communal wiping. You can imagine it, hundreds of hands, dozens of pies, one eternally damp rag. Not exactly the elegance you've become used to, but entirely normal. Historians still argue whether these communal cloths were consciously seen as napkins or simply generic cleaning tools. What's clear is that the practice of personal napkin use was almost exclusively aspirational, part of the growing divide between social classes, If you had your own napkin, you weren't just tidy. You were somebody. You remember an earlier moment in the marketplace before all these fine dinners, when you saw a merchant carefully wrap a wedge of cheese in a square of linen. At the time, you thought it odd. Now you realize that might have been his napkin. Multi-use, yes, but also well cared for. A symbol of his striving respectability. In fact, one of the unexpected roles of the napkin during this time was not at the start of a meal, but at its end. In public houses and coaching inns, it became increasingly fashionable to carry a napkin tucked into your belt or bag not to use during the meal, but to clean yourself afterward before re-entering polite society. Kind of like carrying your own towel to freshen up before rejoining the stage. You imagine it now, a young apprentice finishing his stew, wiping his hands with a small embroidered square, nodding to the barkeep, and heading back to the workshop with clean fingers and just a little extra dignity. He's not noble, but his napkin says, "I care." By the late 16th century, this kind of behavior became part of what we'd now call social mobility. Linen ownership and the correct use of it marked your aspirations. Servants at noble houses were often trained in napkin handling before they learned to serve food. In some cases, a well-folded napkin from a servant could be a silent nod to their own ambitions. Because you never knew who might be watching. This, of course, bled into other parts of daily life. Weddings, christenings, even funerals. Napkins, or their close cousins, decorative cloths, were presented to guests, embroidered with initials or religious motifs. They might not be used for actual wiping, but they carried meaning. A funeral napkin wasn't for tears, it was for memory. A wedding napkin might be kissed, then folded and kept as a token. And here's where things take a particularly poetic turn. Some young lovers reportedly exchanged napkins as tokens of affection, folded delicately, perhaps with a sprig of herbs or a single stitch of color unique to the sender. No grand gestures, no florid sonnets, just cloth simple, soft, and filled with subtext. Imagine that. Instead of flowers, you receive a square of linen. You unfold it, and inside is the faint scent of mint and a barely visible embroidered heart. You tuck it away, not in a drawer, but in your sleeve, close to your skin. Your beloved never says a word, but when you see them at church, they're wearing the matching napkin, folded into the shape of a rose. It's all very subtle, very Elizabethan, very swoony. You look down at your own napkin now. You've unfolded and refolded it 3 times during this train of thought. Each time a little differently. You wonder what message you've been sending. Probably, this person is nervous and mildly sticky. Even among nobility, napkins played romantic and ceremonial roles. There's a tale of an earl who had napkins woven with lines from a favorite poem, then used them exclusively for dinners with his would-be bride. Each dinner, a new stanza, a fabric love letter. Whether the story is true or not, it's deeply on brand for the Elizabethans, who adored a little melancholy wrapped in muslin. Of course, not all napkin messages were quite so tender. In some noble households, the absence of a napkin was a pointed insult. If you arrived at a table and found no cloth by your trencher, it meant you'd fallen out of favor, or worse, that your host had no intention of treating you as an equal. It was the Tudor equivalent of ghosting, but with more starch. So here you sit between courses with your napkin draped just so, wondering whether someone across the table is watching you, judging you, reading your folds. Because in this world, every cloth tells a story, and your story is still unfolding crease by crease, thread by thread. You're getting good at this. Dinner's winding down, and you've officially survived 3 courses, 2 suspicious puddings, and 1 overly talkative gentleman who referred to his goose as unctuously tender. You've sipped your wine like a courtier, wiped your hands at all the right intervals, and folded your napkin so precisely it might qualify as a small boat. But just as you begin to feel confident, the room starts to shift. Not in reality, but in mood. The candles burn lower. The servers move more slowly. Conversation turns from politics and property to something softer. Love, poetry, memory. The feast is ending. The pageant is folding away. And this, strangely enough, is when the napkin takes on one of its most fascinating and emotional roles. Because as odd as it sounds, Elizabethan napkins had a kind of afterlife. Long after the plates were cleared and the custards consumed, those neatly folded squares of linen continued to carry meaning, sometimes far beyond the dinner table. Let's start with a simple truth. People didn't throw things away. Fabric was precious, linen even more so. Napkins were washed, mended, bleached in the sun, and reused dozens, even hundreds of times. Over the years, a single napkin might pass from mother to daughter, servant to master, host to guest. It would be refolded, relabeled, repurposed. And in that journey, it absorbed stories. There's an old tale half myth, half memory about a widow in Devon who kept a napkin embroidered with her late husband's initials. Not a dramatic keepsake, just a plain square of cloth he'd used every Thursday for years. After his passing, she folded it into her bodice each market day, so he could still dine with her, as the story goes. No gold, no jewels, just linen and longing, and she wasn't alone. Napkins became tokens of affection, inheritance, even mourning. In the inventories of the time, you'll find references to the white napkin of mother's hand or father's feast cloth. These weren't luxury items, they were memory held in fabric. Historians still argue whether these traditions were more common in rural or urban households, but the pattern remains. People assign meaning to objects that touch them often, and nothing touches you more often literally than a napkin. In noble households, there were even ceremonial uses for napkins at the end of life. A dying nobleman might request to be buried with a cloth that had been used at his wedding feast or his knighting. Symbolic gestures, yes, but also a kind of linen logic. After all, if the napkin had borne witness to your best moments, why shouldn't it accompany you into your last? Of course, not all post-dinner napkin tailies are so poignant. Some are downright petty. Take the story of Lady Weston of Hampshire, who reportedly took offense when a guest left his napkin folded inside out. She read it as a slight subtle dig at her table service. Whether it was or wasn't remains unclear, but the lady never invited him back. Napkin drama, the silent killer of Tudor friendships. And while today we might ball our napkins and toss them on the plate, no offense intended, such behavior in Elizabethan England would be interpreted as rude at best, insulting at worst. How you folded your napkin at the end of the meal mattered. It signaled gratitude, satisfaction, and even your hope to return. You now know the drill. Fold gently, place beside your trencher, never on your plate. To do otherwise would be to say, I am done with this household. An unspoken farewell. Some households even adopted their own little napkin rituals. A common one, a folded triangle with the point facing away from the guest meant thank you for the meal. A triangle pointing inward, your eel pie betrayed me. And that's just the end of dinner. Beyond the table, napkins had afterlives in every corner of daily life. Old, worn cloths became polishing rags, baby wraps, cheese strainers, or stuffing for chair cushions. You might open an old chest and find a folded napkin stuffed between manuscripts, yellowed with age and reeking faintly of lavender and roast lamb. Sometimes they became part of romantic exchanges. A folded napkin might be slipped into a lover's satchel, embroidered with a secret symbol, an arrow, a fish, a pinnacone. For the literate, a few lines of verse might be stitched or written in ink. For the less so, a simple tear at the corner could be enough. I was here. I cared. This is yours. You think back to earlier in the evening, the woman across the table who blotted her lips and then seemed to cradle her napkin as though it held a secret. Maybe it did. Maybe she'd sewn in a tiny message, one stitch at a time, waiting for someone to notice. And suddenly, it all makes sense. Napkins weren't just a tool. They were part of the emotional language of Elizabethan life, a way to show care, or disdain, or memory, or longing. When words were too loud or forbidden, linen spoke softly. So you finish your meal. You place your knife carefully aside. You fold your napkin once, twice, just enough to say, "Thank you, I noticed. I'll remember." No one claps, no one remarks, but the host sees. The servant nods, and someone down the table glances at your fold and mimics it with their own cloth. It's a conversation in silence, a language without words, and somehow you've learned to speak it. The meal is over now. The last of the trenchers have been cleared, their sodden bottoms scraped into pails for the dogs, or perhaps for the less fortunate. The guests are stretching, yawning politely, or retiring to quieter corners of the hall. A lute starts up somewhere soft, meandering notes drifting through the air like incense. You sit still, your napkin now folded in your lap, almost tenderly. You've learned to respect it. Maybe even love it, just a little. But what you might not have realized, what Elizabethan hosts certainly did, is that the story of the napkin doesn't begin at the table. No. Like all good things in this time, it starts with labor, with hands, with hours of care often invisible. Because before a napkin can touch your lips, someone had to make it. Welcome to the workshop. Imagine a small, timber-framed room lit by tallow candles and crammed with the clatter of spinning wheels and looms. Here, the napkin begins its life not as something refined, but as flax. A crop grown in English fields, though still often imported from the Low Countries for its superior quality. The fibers must be harvested, retted, dried, combed, and spun. Already we're talking weeks of effort, and you haven't even gotten to the weaving. Historians still argue whether most domestic linen production was truly cottage industry, or if larger guilds had begun dominating the supply by the late 16th century. But there's no denying the importance of linen workers, spinsters, weavers, fullers who turned humble flax into the fine white cloth fit for a Tudor banquet. Your napkin, if you could trace it back, might have been woven by a widow and her daughters, seated side by side at a loom that creaked with every pull. The threads must be taut, the pattern consistent. Even the simplest napkin required an eye for balance, too loose and the cloth frays, too tight and it puckers. Linen, as every weaver knew, was both strong and fickle. Once woven, the fabric had to be washed and whitened. This was no simple rinse. The best napkins were bleached in stages soaked in lye, laid out in the sun for days at a time, then scrubbed and rinsed again. It was a brutal process, and the smell? Less than charming, but the result? Pure, smooth cloth with that faint sun-sweet scent that said, "This came from the earth and the hands of the diligent." You picture it now, sheets of white linen fluttering over hedgerows, weighed down with stones to keep them from flying off in the wind. A whole meadow of future napkins soaking up the sky. But that's just the beginning. Once the cloth was prepared, it had to be cut and hemmed. This work fell to seamstresses women with nimble fingers and sharp eyes. Most napkins were simple squares, but the wealthy demanded perfection. Straight edges, tight stitching, no loose threads. And for the truly fashionable, embroidery. A noblewoman might request her family crest stitched into each napkin, or her initials, perhaps accompanied by a border of strawberries, vines, or Tudor roses. These additions weren't just for beauty. They were marks of ownership, pride, even legacy. You can imagine the instructions: 8 dozen napkins initialed for Lady Mayhew's midsummer banquet. And no thistles this time. Some embroidery work was done in noble households by the women themselves. It was considered a proper, pastime decorative, ladylike, and conveniently silent. But the bulk of production fell on professional embroiderers. Often women, often underpaid, and almost always invisible. Their work, delicate and precise, disappeared into the folds of dinner, rarely acknowledged but always expected. And what of the servants? After the napkin was made, it entered a second, more punishing phase of its life: maintenance. This job, too, fell largely to women washerwomen, laundresses, chambermaids. If you think laundering is tiresome today, try scrubbing wine stains with lye soap in a wooden tub the size of a cider barrel. Try wringing cloth by hand, drying it on a rope strung over a smoky hearth, then smoothing it out with a heated stone or brick wrapped in wool. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard, wet, repetitive labor. And every noble family with any pretensions to class expected their napkins to be spotless. Any discoloration or damp smell could lead to reprimand or worse, dismissal. A servant's career could live or die by the crease of a napkin. It makes you look at the cloth in your hand a little differently. It's not just a square of linen, it's a chain of hands. A thread that connects field to table, sweat to ceremony. Even the storage of napkins required care. Fine linen was often wrapped in muslin, laid between sprigs of dried herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary, and kept in chests to discourage moths and mildew. Some households assigned a specific maid just to manage the linen room. She would record how many napkins were used per meal, who had handled them, and when they were due to be washed. Linen theft was a genuine concern. After all, napkins didn't grow on trees, they grew from labor. And yet, despite all this effort, napkins were expected to perform flawlessly. No guest was meant to think about where the napkin had come from, who had stitched it, who had scrubbed out the goose fat or patched the tear in the corner. They were to be seen as effortless, pure, white, perfect, like magic. But you know better now. You look around at the table, the fading candlelight, the yawning guests, the glint of silver, and you wonder how many people here have ever considered the labor that made their dining so graceful. The folded cloths, the crisp creases, the subtle scent of thyme or clove, that's not refinement. That's someone's aching back, someone's raw fingers. So the next time you lift a napkin to your lips, you do it a little more slowly, a little more gently. Because now, you understand, you're not just wiping your mouth. You're touching a story woven from sweat, starch, and silent pride. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls. It's late now. The meal has long ended, and the guests have dispersed, some to bed, some to chambers with wine and whispered plans. The great hall is quieter, but you remain at the long table, absently toying with your napkin. You fold it, unfold it, fold it again. Because tonight, this simple square of cloth has become something more than a table accessory. It's a passport, a witness, a character in its own right. And in section 10 of our gentle descent into the world of Elizabethan napkins, it's time to turn from dinner to drama. Specifically the theater. Yes, dear listener, napkins had a starring role in the Elizabethan stage. Not always literal, but always present in the way audiences understood manners, status, and meaning. And no playwright loved a good cloth-based metaphor quite like a certain William Shakespeare. Historians still argue whether napkins were commonly used by all social classes attending the globe, but what's clear is that their symbolic presence in plays carried weight. Consider one of Shakespeare's most famous props, the fateful handkerchief in Othello. Often translated in modern terms as a handkerchief, scholars note that the original language, napkin, reveals something different: a domestic object, a token, a piece of intimacy disguised as utility. Desdemona's napkin is not just fabric. It's proof of love, of betrayal, of identity. When she misplaces it, when it ends up in Iago's scheming hands, it becomes the thread that unravels everything, all from a little folded cloth. And therein lies the deeper truth. In Elizabethan drama, the napkin was shorthand. It represented cleanliness, certainly, but also loyalty, service, femininity, and sometimes even erotic tension. A man offering a woman a napkin could be a chivalrous gesture or a calculated move. A woman offering her own napkin, scandalous or heartbreaking, depending on the stitching. One particularly juicy stage direction from an early Jacobean play reads, "He presents her a napkin, bloodied," which, even if fictional, tells you everything you need to know about how emotionally charged such an object could be. A napkin could conceal a token, catch a secret, wipe away tears or evidence. Of course, not all napkin moments were tragic. Some were comic. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff is stuffed into a laundry basket alongside napkins, stockings, and dirty linen, a moment of physical comedy that got big laughs in its day. Why? Because audiences understood the napkin's role in everyday life. They saw themselves in the linens. And that's the key. The Elizabethan audience wasn't just passively watching these props on stage. They were using them at home, folding them at dinner, arguing over whose initials should be stitched on which cloth. So when a napkin appeared on stage tossed, treasured, torn, it carried emotional resonance. Even off stage, the theatrical world borrowed from the rituals of table linen. Actors performing for noble households were expected to observe the same etiquette as dinner guests. If they dined with patrons before or after a performance, their napkin use would be closely watched. Fold too sloppily, dab too greedily, you might not get invited back. Some traveling companies even brought their own linens, modest ones, perhaps a bit frayed but clean. Because a well-presented actor, like a well-folded napkin, earned trust. It was showmanship on and off the stage. There are records, delightfully gossipy ones, of actors gifting embroidered napkins to noble patrons. One letter from a courtier grumbles that fellow of the stage did give my lady a napkin most finely stitched. And she did keep it, the nerve, the linen audacity. In some cases, the napkin doubled as fan merchandise. Patrons would stitch scenes or lines from plays onto cloth as keepsakes. One surviving fragment bears the words, "Out, damned spot," likely stitched not as a moral reprimand, but a nod to Lady Macbeth and her doomed attempt to wash away guilt. It's both a quote and a joke about stains. Two birds, one thread. You begin to realize the napkin was more than etiquette. It was narrative. Whether at dinner or in drama, it helped tell the story, quietly, repeatedly, symbolically. And let's not forget the servants, stagehands, and backstage folk. For them, napkins and towels were part of the practical fabric of performance used to mop sweat, clean paint-stained hands, or wrap up stolen meat pies. It's easy to imagine a young boy actor wiping off rouge with a cloth still bearing the faint scent of lamb stew from lunch. So here you sit, your own napkin folded on the table before you, and you wonder, what part did it play tonight? What story did it help tell? Were you the composed courtier? The eager apprentice? The mysterious stranger with a threadbare cloth and a hidden past? The room is quiet now, the candles are low. But in your hand remains that small, square symbol of civilization, of theater, of mess and meaning. And just for a moment, you feel like a character in a play, whispering lines only the linen understands. The hearth crackles low now, its warm orange light curling across the flagstones and the remains of a once boisterous meal. The smells have faded, the roasted meats, the stewed fruits, the clove-heavy puddings, all but gone. What lingers is linen, that faint powdery scent of sun-dried cloth, warm starch, and a hint of herbs. It clings to your fingertips. You're alone now in the great hall, save for a sleepy servant stacking pewter platters, his motion slow and practiced. Your napkin lies still beside your trencher, not dirty, but not clean. Used, yes, but gently. And now, in this quiet hour, we turn to an even softer corner of the story. If you've been with us since the first folded triangle, you've probably guessed that the napkin so humble, so absorbent, wasn't just for catching gravy. It was a kind of mirror. And in Elizabethan England, Few mirrors were more important than those reflecting gender roles. Yes, this section is all about how napkin use in linen culture in general told people whether you were masculine, feminine, graceful, powerful, or something awkward in between. Let's start, as always, with the expectations. A man, in Elizabethan terms, was supposed to demonstrate control of his household, of his appetite, and, yes, even of his crumbs. Table manners were seen as a form of moral discipline, and nothing betrayed a lack of that discipline faster than a man who wiped his greasy fingers on his tunic instead of his napkin. There are etiquette books from the era lovingly specific that instruct young men not to foul thy fingers upon thy doublet, and to wipe thee upon clean linen, folded not flung. The implication was clear. Only the uncultured wiped their mouths like animals. A true gentleman used a napkin with care. Not too dainty, no fluttering dabs, please, but not boorish either. A confident wipe, a thoughtful fold. A pause between bites to maintain cleanliness. This was masculine grace, neatly defined. And women? Well, that's where things get more intricate. A lady's relationship with her napkin was not merely one of cleanliness, it was performance. Women were expected to show restraint, delicacy, and a kind of effortless grace that made the napkin feel less like a tool and more like an extension of the hand. A well-born woman did not use her napkin so much as caress it. Gently pat, barely blot. One guide for young gentlewomen even suggested that a lady's cloth shall not remember the meal. In other words, she should make it appear as though she never ate it all. You let that one sink in? Imagine trying to enjoy a pie made of minced pork, stewed apples, and candied ginger all while pretending you weren't actually chewing. It's no wonder women were trained to take smaller bites and to dab at the corners of their mouths as if wiping away invisible sins. The napkin became a kind of veil, modest and controlled, even when the food was messy and rich. Historians still debate whether these gendered expectations were more strictly enforced in aristocratic circles than among the gentry, but personal accounts suggest that even in merchant households, daughters were coached in napkin etiquette just as rigorously as in posture or embroidery. And then there's the matter of folding. Yes, folding a napkin carried gendered connotations too. Men were more likely to refold their napkins into simple shaped squares. Rectangles, triangles, quick, efficient, symbolic of a tidy mind. Women, particularly in households with servants to observe, sometimes folded theirs into more elaborate forms. A swan, a rose, a fan. These folds weren't purely decorative. They were tiny performances of grace and skill watched by others. There's even record of one Elizabethan hostess who trained her daughters to fold their napkins into a new flower each night before dinner. One guest reportedly burst into applause when the youngest girl presented a fully formed iris. Talk about folding under pressure, but the napkin wasn't always a gentle enforcer. Sometimes it exposed more than it concealed. A poorly folded napkin, or one dropped repeatedly, could betray nervousness, clumsiness, a failure to meet one's role. Just like a stained ruff or a crooked stocking, it signaled a lapse in composure. And while such things might be laughed off by men as mere forgetfulness, women were judged far more harshly for similar missteps. You begin to see how fragile the social script was, and how napkins were part of it, folded into expectations, ironed into behaviors. But not everyone followed the rules. There are scattered accounts, charming and quietly rebellious, of women who flouted napkin norms. One widow in Kent was known to wipe her hands with the hem of her apron, though linen sat beside her plate. A tavern hostess in Bristol taught her serving girls to use napkins like men, firm, quick, without apology. And then there's the curious story of a woman in Norfolk who embroidered her napkin with a hawk in flight. When asked why, she said, "Because I bite like one." In other words, not every woman wanted to appear napkin gentle. And not every man succeeded in mastering his cloth. One satirical poem from the era mocks Sir Drôle-a-lot, a fictional nobleman who dines with napkin round his neck and chin, and still the goose fat wins. It's a reminder that no matter how many books or rules existed, some folks were just messier than others. You shift now in your chair, fingers gently pressing the soft fabric beside you. It's not just linen anymore. It's a quiet measure of who you are, or at least who others think you should be. The napkin has judged. The napkin has witnessed. But perhaps most importantly, the napkin has absorbed. And not just sauces or grease or wine, but all the complex expectations of gender, class, and behavior that sat invisible beside every trencher in Elizabethan England. So you fold it again, neatly, elegantly, not because you have to, but because in this moment you understand the silent language of cloth. And you've decided what it will say. There's a peculiar stillness that settles in great houses once the final embers burn low. You sit alone now in the near dark, the napkin resting lightly across your lap like a cat that's chosen to stay. The room feels like it's breathing quiet and slow, as if the wood beams and stone walls are sighing in unison. It's in the softness, in the hush after ritual, that the napkin reveals its final Elizabethan identity. A symbol not of cleanliness or class or courtship, but of control. Because while we've seen how napkins dance between genders, meals, and memory, there's another thread woven through their history, the constant undercurrent of order. Who uses which napkin, when, how, and why, it all says something about who's in charge. Let's start with the obvious, the head of the household. Whether a noble lord, a widowed baroness, or a wealthy merchant, the person seated at the head of the table wasn't just in charge of the roast. They directed the entire rhythm of the meal. When to start, when to speak, when to raise a goblet or rise from the bench. And napkins? They were part of that choreography. It was common for the head of the house to have the finest napkin larger, thicker, or more ornately stitched than those offered to guests. Sometimes theirs alone would be perfumed or folded in a distinct shape. You might not say they were more important, but you could see it right there by their trencher. And in some households, the meal wouldn't begin until that one napkin was unfolded. The subtle rustle of linen marked the start of the ritual, like a conductor lifting a baton, no fanfare, just fabric. You picture it now, the hush before the meal. Everyone seated, eyes discreetly on the host. Then the single movement one napkin unfolded, and suddenly everyone else follows suit. A quiet ballet of folds and fingers. Dinner has begun. Historians still argue whether this formality was more prevalent in older rural estates or in newer, upwardly mobile merchant homes. But the message remained consistent. Napkins weren't just tools. They were signals. Even among guests, there was a hierarchy. Important visitors received fresher linen, embroidered edges, perhaps even silver rings to hold the cloth in place. Lesser guests, simpler cloth, perhaps with a faint restitch from a previous meal. Not enough to insult, just enough to remind. You realize now how political the dining table could be. And the napkin, silent, obedient, was enlisted in the service of that delicate diplomacy. Servants, too, operated within the system. For them, the napkin was a marker of their role, a visible part of their uniformity. The napkin bearer was an actual job in grand households, a footman or page responsible for presenting, collecting, and sometimes even folding the napkins for each guest. Their movements were rehearsed. Their timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the guest felt rushed. Too late, and they felt forgotten. There's even a record of one servant being dismissed from a viscount's household for leaving the cloth in confusion. No details were given, but one imagines a mix-up of folds. Perhaps the host received the guest's napkin by mistake. A tiny error, but one that hinted at chaos. And we can't have that. Not in a world where napkins meant control. That control extended to the laundry room as well. Linen was counted obsessively, each napkin logged, folded, stored, and rechecked. Stealing a napkin was treated almost as seriously as stealing silver, not because of the fabric's value, but because it disrupted the order. It meant someone had breached the system. Some households branded their linens tiny inked initials in the corners to make tracking easier. Others relied on servants' memories. That's Lady Riston's apple blossom cloth. One laundress might whisper to another. The one with the crease like a wishbone. You picture it now, a linen room with shelves like library stacks. Each napkin folded precisely, scented with rosemary and lemon balm, awaiting its next performance. A kingdom of cloth. But not all control was so tidy. There are stories, half whispers, in letters and court documents of napkins being used against the system, a misplaced cloth hinting at an affair, a deliberately stained corner left as protest. Even servants using napkins to smuggle food, notes, or small items hidden within those soft, obedient folds. A woman in London reportedly folded a coin into a napkin and handed it to a guest as payment for silence about a scandal. Another tale tells of a merchant's son who used his napkin to pass letters to a servant girl, eventually resulting in a secret engagement. And perhaps most charming, a guest who folded his napkin into a ship and floated it in the finger bowl, a gentle protest against the meal's blandness. The host, to his credit, replied the next night by folding his own napkin into a chicken and placing it on the guest's plate. Napkin diplomacy. Folded banter. All these acts, tiny, private, and visible to most, undermined the very control the napkin was supposed to represent. A square of linen turned into a whisper, a joke, a rebellion. So as you sit here now, surrounded by silence and 1,000 invisible rules, you realize something delicious. Even within the strictest systems, softness can carry secrets. The napkin, after all, has always been the quietest object on the table. But it's also the one closest to your hands, your mouth, your heart. And sometimes the things we control the most are the ones that hold the most power. The candles have burned down to nubs, now mere puddles of wax with lazy little flames still clinging on. You sit perfectly still in the hush, the kind of hush that only comes after stories, after feasts, after everything that could be said has been said. Your napkin, folded neatly beside your hand, looks like it might fall asleep too. But before the linen dreams, there's one more corner of the Elizabethan world we haven't unfolded, the world beyond England. Because as tidy as Elizabeth's court liked to be, its linen customs didn't spring fully formed from English soil. Like most things in the 16th century, they were part of a bigger patchwork borrowed, traded, adapted, and occasionally stolen from the wider tapestry of Europe and beyond. So now, in these last glowing hours, we sail gently into international waters, napkin edition. Let's begin with the Italians because, of course, they were first. Italy had been refining table manners for centuries by the time Elizabeth ascended the throne. The Renaissance nobles of Florence, Venice, and Milan were using tablecloths and napkins when English diners were still sharing trenchers and licking their fingers with abandon. Italian etiquette books, especially those by Giovanni Della, Casa spelled out the rules of napkin decorum with eyebrow-raising detail. For example, a gentleman should not, under any circumstance, blow his nose in the table napkin, nor should he use it to clean the teeth with sound, which we can only assume meant that dreaded post-dinner whistle-suck maneuver. England took notes, quite literally. These books were translated, circulated, and adapted by English printers eager to elevate the manners of their countrymen. And so, slowly but surely, Italian napkin habits crept across the channel. Historians still argue whether English households followed these foreign customs closely or simply cherry-picked the fancier ones. But one thing is certain, the idea of the napkin as a status object, something that reflected your refinement, owes a great deal to Renaissance Italy. Then there were the French. Ah, the French. If Italians gave us form, the French gave us flair. French nobles of the 1500s weren't content with plain linen squares. Their napkins came scalloped, lace-trimmed, perfumed, and embroidered with frippery so delicate it could induce a fainting spell. One duke's household reportedly folded every napkin into the shape of a bird every day. Imagine the pressure. French influence reached England through diplomatic visits, court marriages, and the trickle of French tutors hired to teach young English nobles how not to embarrass themselves abroad. And with them came a distinctly Gallic approach to linen, elegant, expressive, and a touch theatrical. Of course, not all these influences were welcomed with open arms. There was suspicion, especially among the more Protestant households, that too much elegance could breed moral decay. A napkin, they whispered, should be useful, not a puppet in one's lap. Still, the folding tricks caught on, especially among the upper crust. German households, meanwhile, brought something else to the table: discipline. Records from Augsburg and Nuremberg detail strict linen inventories, how many napkins per guest, how often they should be boiled, folded, inspected, rotated. Their folding styles tended toward the geometric neat, stacked fans and angled peaks, reliable, predictable, the kind of folds you could set your watch by. It's easy to imagine a German linen keeper side-eyeing a French swan fold with quiet disapproval. Yeah, but does it wipe well? And further afield, well, napkin culture gets even more intriguing. In parts of the Ottoman Empire, where luxurious textiles were symbols of power, guests were sometimes presented with cloths scented with rosewater or sandalwood, folded elegantly and handed by servants wearing silken gloves. While not quite napkins in the Western dining sense, these scented cloths served a similar role, cleansing, refreshing, and signaling the guest's value. English travelers returning from Istanbul or Cairo often wrote home about fragrant cloths or courtesy towels, describing the experience with equal parts admiration and envy. Some noble households tried to imitate the ritual with scented linen, though given England's climate and laundry conditions, the results were often more mildew than musk. Even further east, in Ming Dynasty China, table linens existed too, though the etiquette of communal dishes and chopstick use made napkins less central to the meal itself. However, hand cloths used both for cleanliness and as a sign of refinement were part of elite banquets. There's even a record of a Chinese diplomatic gift to Elizabeth, the first that included embroidered cloths, possibly silk, napkins, perhaps, or something adjacent. In either case, cloth diplomacy was very much a thing. And here's something charming. In the Aztec Empire, cloth napkins woven from cotton or maguey fibers were often part of feasts. Some nobles even had them dyed with natural pigments, their patterns indicating rank or ceremonial role. When the Spanish arrived, they took note of these cloths, not just their function, but their artistry. A napkin wasn't merely a napkin. It was status, sacredness, signal. And yet, when these global influences filtered back into England, they didn't always take root. The colder climate, the rigid social order, and the particular Englishness of English dining meant that napkins, while imported in inspiration, remained homegrown in attitude. Still, you can trace the echoes. A scalloped edge here, a perfumed fold there, a rumor of silk tucked into a cedar-lined chest. You begin to understand that the napkin, so simple in form, was in fact a global citizen, a cloth with passport stamps. And every fold you've practiced tonight owes its lineage, not just to English laundresses and noble banquets, but to a chorus of voices across centuries and continents who believed that even the smallest square of fabric could carry grace. So as you rest your hand lightly on your napkin, you smile, because you've touched a piece of the world, folded it, and in your quiet way, kept it safe. The world feels distant now, quiet, faded, as if wrapped in cloth and set on a shelf. The fire's gone out. The long banquet table is bare. Even the shadows seem to have dozed off. Only your napkin remains, soft beneath your fingers as we turn toward the twilight of our tale. And twilight in the Elizabethan world meant one thing: preparation, because napkins weren't just used. They were maintained, curated, treasured. And when the party was over, when the laughter had dwindled and the pudding bowls were licked clean, the real work began. Welcome to the ritual of linen care. You might think a napkin's job ends with dinner, but oh, you sweet summer sleeper in Tudor England, that's when the napkin's second life truly began. The very first step, collection. Servants moved like clockwork, scooping up every cloth with practiced efficiency. But not too quickly, you couldn't risk appearing rude, as if you were rushing the guests. A gentle pace, a quiet touch. Napkins were folded, not balled, never crumpled, and gathered into large baskets lined with muslin to protect them on the journey to the laundry quarters. Now, here's where things get intense. Laundry in the 16th century was an ordeal. No washing machines, no gentle rinse cycles. Just lye, elbow grease, and weather permitting. In most grand households, laundry was done once every few weeks, sometimes even monthly, so items like napkins had to be handled in rotation. You didn't just wash all your napkins, you washed them while others were used. A little cloth choreography. Laundresses, usually women, worked in teams. First, they sorted. Fresh stains, set stains, blood, ink, and the mysterious ones nobody wanted to ask about. Then came the soak. Napkins were placed in wooden tubs filled with water and maya, powerful alkaline solution made from wood ash and rainwater. It smelled like bird soap and ambition. Cloths would be stirred, stomped, and scrubbed until stains surrendered or the fabric did. Delicate embroidery? Too bad. The lye didn't care about your swans. Historians still argue whether this method weakened linen over time or seasoned it, the way cast iron gets better with use. Some households added fragrant herbs, lavender, thyme, even rose petals to soften the smell. Others just let the wind do the work. After soaking came rinsing. Buckets of clean water were poured again and again until the cloth was free of suds. And then came bleaching. Napkins weren't dried indoors. Oh no, they were laid out on bleaching greens, grassy patches exposed to sun and dew. The combination of ultraviolet light and cool morning moisture worked magic. Over days, the linen grew whiter, softer, and more even. If you've ever sun-dried your sheets, you know the feeling. Fresh, crisp, just a little wild. But the magic wasn't just in the sun. It was in the care. Women monitored the linens like hawks, chasing away birds, brushing off beetles, and whispering curses when the clouds came in. Rain could ruin days of work. So could smoke from a nearby chimney and foxes. Let's just say that more than one napkin met its end as part of a woodland den. Once dry, the napkins were ironed, or more accurately, pressed. Flat stones were heated and wrapped in flannel, then glided over the cloth to smooth it. No steam, no knobs, just weight and patience. A good pressing could restore a napkin's dignity. A bad one could scorch it into shame. After pressing came folding. This was an art form in itself, and each household had its style. Some favored the classic square, others folded into rectangles with beveled corners. And then there were the elaborate ones, fans, diamonds, Lilith. Folding wasn't just functional, it was messaging. A well-folded napkin said, "This house knows order. This family respects its guests. This dinner matters." Finally, the napkins were stored. In great oak chests, often lined with linen themselves, the cloths were stacked by set. Each set might include dozens of napkins, more if the household hosted frequently. To keep moths away, women tucked in dried herbs or sachets of cloves and citrus peel. Some chests had secret compartments. Others were locked with iron keys passed from mother to daughter. The linen room, if the house was large enough to have one, was a realm of quiet pride. The mistress of the house might oversee its inventory personally, marking which napkins had been used at which feasts, and which ones had the initials of distant cousins stitched in pale thread. And if a napkin was too worn, it was demoted, first to a kitchen rag, then to a cleaning cloth, eventually to a polishing square for shoes or pewter. Rarely was it thrown away. Even in its final days, a napkin had work to do. And sometimes, just sometimes, a napkin lived on as something else entirely. A child's doll dress, a handkerchief, a book wrap, a tiny shroud for a bird buried in the garden. Because fabric, like memory, is never wasted. You sit there now, holding your napkin gently. It's not just a square of linen, it's a survivor. A veteran of dinners, a relic of labor, a quiet thing that's seen so much and said so little. And tomorrow, it'll start again. A new fold, a new meal, a new story. But tonight, it rests. And so do you. The silence now feels complete, thick, and soft like wool. Even the walls seem to exhale, their cold stone warmed just enough by memory. You don't move. The only thing that shifts is the slow rise and fall of your own breath, mirrored by the delicate napkin on your lap, barely stirred by the gentlest draft in the room. And here, at the edge of sleep, we turn to the most curious part of all, how something as seemingly mundane as a napkin became a kind of cultural ghost. Because as the Elizabethan era faded and newer fashions took hold, lace cuffs, powdered wigs, more forks than anyone really needed, the napkin quietly evolved. It didn't vanish, but it began to drift. In a sense, this final chapter isn't about the napkin as an object anymore. It's about its afterlife, the way it lingered in rituals and sayings, in the folds of English memory long after Elizabeth herself was gone. Let's begin with what followed. As the Stuart period arrived and eventually gave way to the Georgian age, napkin customs became less rigid but also more elaborate. By the 18th century, folding napkins into ornate shapes had become something of a competitive sport among elite households. There were guidebooks, actual manuals for folding a goose, a ship, a pineapple. Some families hired specialist folders. Imagine that on your CV, professional napkin sculptor. But this theatricality wasn't born in a vacuum. It echoed the Elizabethan sense that linens could speak volumes about wealth, about welcome, about where you sat in the social order. Those roots ran deep. And while the folding styles changed, the deeper associations remained. You might not have noticed, but the very language we use around linens still carries those old ghosts. Air your dirty laundry, fold under pressure, keep it under wraps. All quiet echoes of a time when cloth wasn't just cloth, it was communication. Historians still debate whether the napkin's symbolic power ever truly peaked again after Elizabeth's reign, but its practical use endured, and with it, a trail of tiny traces. For instance, in 19th century England, dinner invitations often specified whether napkins would be provided. Yes, really. Because in some circles, especially among the rising middle class, it was expected that you might bring your own, personalized, embroidered, maybe even scented. And here's a charming footnote. In the diaries of rural families, there are accounts of napkin rotations, not just for use, but for luck. Sarah's cloth is set for Friday at Fold Sweet, one entry reads. No explanation given. Just the sense that some napkins brought a smoother meal, less quarrels, better digestion. Even in mourning, napkins found roles. Special black edge cloths were used during funeral feasts, folded once, never twice. Superstition? Probably. But in a world of ritual, every crease mattered. And in the archives, tucked between pages of legal documents and farm ledgers, are tiny scraps of linen used as bookmarks, placeholders, even love tokens. One such square, found pressed between the pages of a devotional book from 1607, bears a single stitched word. Wait, was it a napkin? A kerchief? A whisper? No one knows, but it tells you something important. That cloth-like history holds on longer than we expect. You begin to realize that napkins weren't just tools of etiquette or luxury. They were records. They captured the everyday, spills, smiles, absences. They soaked up lives. You could almost say they were the quiet chroniclers of their time. And maybe that's why the napkin persists. In drawers and drawers of family linens across the world, long after we stopped using them daily, we keep them. We don't always know why, but we do because they feel like history, folded. So you sit now in the quiet dark, your fingers lightly grazing the edge of your cloth. It doesn't matter if it's cotton or linen or memory. It matters that it's there, still, like the flicker of a candle that's forgotten it's supposed to go out. And now, as the final folds of our story drift into the stillness, your breath begins to lengthen. Your shoulders settle just a bit deeper. You've made it through trestle tables and trenchers, through swans and starch, through greasy fingers and embroidery, so fine it whispered. The story of the Elizabethan napkin is not just about dining, or manners, or even linen. It's about all the quiet things that carry meaning when no one's looking. The rituals we perform, the customs we inherit, the softness we reach for in a world that often forgets to be soft. Let it all fade now, the courtly rules, the folding instructions, the scent of rosemary pressed between sheets of cloth. Let the great hall grow dark, the guests retire, the fire die low. You're warm, you're still. You're right where you need to be. Whatever you've carried with you today, questions, worries, that nagging sense you've forgotten something important, it can wait. Let it rest, folded neatly like linen on a shelf. Let your thoughts wander as they please, or not at all. And as you drift off, remember this. Even the smallest square of cloth has its history, and so do you. Tomorrow, the world will unfold again. But for now, you can close your eyes. You've earned this quiet. You've earned this peace. Good night.